Is Donald Trump helping or hindering US growth at this point?
So economic growth, I don't actually think there's much of an impact at all. So we've seen a lot of confidence, but companies and consumers aren't willing to spend on the basis of that without some kind of policy coming through. There's potential for a boost to growth. If we get tax reform, if we get deregulation, if we get infrastructure spending, that will all boost the economy. The question is, how sustainably will it actually boost the economies? And there, I think it's more a bunch of sugar hits that we might get down the line. I think it might take a bit longer than most people expect, particularly given that we have the midterm elections next year. And I think the boost will be a little bit smaller than a lot of investors had initially thought right after the election. So if we get some of these policy reforms, then maybe we'll get a sugar hit to the economy. Fundamentally, 5 years down the line, I don't think potential GDP growth in the U.S. will have really shifted. And so the U.S. remains a 2% economy, roughly.
Does timing matter at this point? I think the market had priced in quick change on reforms initially after the Trump election in November, and they thought it would be a 2017 story, maybe even late 2017. Now, assumptions are saying, well, maybe it's going to be a 2018 story, even later potentially. Does it matter to the U.S. economy when it happens, if it happens?
So it matters to the U.S. economy, it just doesn't matter to the markets anymore. So right after the election, when I spoke to investors, all of their optimism was based on policy that might come through. By now, a lot of investors can see that we might not see any policy anytime soon, but they don't really care. It's such a bull market that they have to be in there anyhow. So I think now actually there's a total divorce between policy coming through and where the markets are headed. But it does affect the U.S. economy. And again, I think we might have to wait until 2019 for a lot of these things, because after the first quarter of next year, we're getting into the midterm elections, and none of these things are uncontroversial. So I think we might have to wait longer than most people think to see these reforms come through. And tax reform, I think, fundamentally might never come through. We might just get a series of tax cuts. Again, that's a sugar hit to the economy, but probably won't shift us off of 2% potential GDP growth.
There's a problem here, though, isn't there? And you make this point in your notes that we're not seeing any real traction in core inflation at this point, in spite of the 12 trillion or whatever that's been thrown at the global economy. All it seems to be doing is creating capacity, which in itself is also deflationary.
Right.
When does that change?
Yeah, so we might see slightly better inflation data towards the end of this year, because we've seen input costs actually go up, and there's quite a big lag before that feeds into inflation data. But ultimately, I don't think we're going to see very strong inflation come in for two main reasons. Back in the 1950s, 2/3 of what we consumed were goods. Now 2/3 of what we consume is services, and services are really low-wage, low-hour sectors. So we're adding all these jobs in low-wage sectors. There's no upward pressure on wages, and therefore no upward pressure on inflation. Secondly, and related to that, we have a massive glut of cheap labor globally, and companies don't have to hire within their borders anymore. And so if we have an oversupply of cheap labor, again, there's no upward pressure on wages in the U.S., or very little at least, and so that takes some of the pressure off of inflation too. These are, big global drivers. We're not going to see either of those trends change anytime soon.